Ladies and gentlemen, the art and science of decision-making is our subject for the next session. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Kahneman, Nobel laureate and professor of psychology and public affairs. This session is moderated by Ms. Mina Al-Arabi, editor-in-chief of The National.
Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, and welcome to this session. I'm delighted to be moderating this session with Professor Daniel Kahneman, who's kindly said I can call him Danny, who of course is a Nobel Prize laureate in economics from 2002, author of many important works, including Thinking Fast and Slow, that has influenced so many people around the world. And here today we are talking about the art and science of decision-making. So Danny, I wanted to start with asking you, how much is art, personality, and how much is science responsible for our decision-making?
Well, personality has a great deal to do with successful decision-making. There is a lot of thinking, and if you don't think properly, you're not going to make the right decisions. But altogether, from my point of view, you would want to reduce the role of personality in decision-making. I mean, you would want to think that problems, at least not necessarily in terms of values, but in terms of your judgment of the situation, that there is a correct answer, and that the correct answer, there is a correct way of thinking about things. Then you can apply your values to the decision-making. And so we would like to reduce, I think, ideally, I would like to reduce the role of personality in the judgment part.
And so then when we talk about science, is that based on data? Is that based on experience? How do we work on that?
Well, I mean, I take it that science means objective data. But it means more than that. It means an objective attitude to data and to facts as against fancy or wishes.
And we live in an era where people question facts. People will say, well, you can find a statistic to prove any argument you want to make. So how do we train ourselves to try to spot that objective data or objective facts?
Well, I mean, there has to be a prior commitment, really. I mean, you cannot just tell people that. This is a commitment you've got to accept ahead of time. The commitment to facts, the commitment to objectivity. And then you train people to use facts, so you train people to collect facts and to evaluate them objectively. But to want to do things on a fact-based, in a fact-based fashion, this is a deeper problem, and that's got to come first.
So the will, and then finding the method. So I want to ask you, increasingly people feel that living in a fast-paced world that we are, in the digital era with so much information available to all of us simultaneously, how do we train our thinking to take in what's reliable, but also do we always have to be thinking fast?
Well, I mean, we cannot think slow all the time. I mean, our intuition is working, and we have to think fast. We're forced to think fast a lot of the time. When it matters, or when one suspects that one is likely to make a mistake, then, the best advice is to slow down. There is no question about it. To slow down and to question yourself.
Many people look to you as somebody who was instrumental in getting our thinking about bias to be developed. People now talk about unconscious bias in a way that you once said almost at the water cooler level. So people generally who would be sitting here or who are listening to us will understand that idea of bias. But you've developed that now because actually not only do we have to think about bias, but we have to think about noise, and that's the title of one of your works. Explain to me the concept of noise.
Well, noise bias is a systematic error. It's a systematic error in measurement, and it's a systematic error in decision-making. Noise is the random part. It's random in measurement, and it's random in decision-making. And there is a lot of noise. There is a lot of noise primarily within organizations. So if you have an organization that is supposed to have interchangeable employees, like many underwriters in an insurance company, you would want the underwriters, when they look at a particular risk, you would want the decision of the company not to be affected by the individual underwriter who made it. It turns out that there is huge variability, even in well-run companies, because they're not aware of that problem. There is a lot of variability in the function of their underwriters. That's noise at the level of the company. And it's a very different problem from bias.
And they say, half of solving a problem is identifying the problem. So say if you run an organization, a ministry, an entity, and you identify this problem of noise, how do you go about tackling it?
Well, that really goes back to your original question. In general, there is a lot of noise in decision-making, and in many domains, it turns out that replacing human judgment by rules or by algorithms or by artificial intelligence is a net improvement. And that happens primarily because human judgment is noisy. So there is a lot of research indicating that in most situations where it's been examined, human judgment competes with fairly simple rules, then the simple rules are at least as good and usually better. More than half of the time they're better than people. And the one reason they are better is that the rules have no noise. You feed in the same problem, you're going to get the same solution. With people, that's not the case.
Okay, we are going to talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and how it can tackle the issue of noise. But before we get there, I wanted to ask you about intuition, because part of that personality, is based on intuition, and some of us, myself included, are usually quite happy with intuition, feeling that gives us a strength that might otherwise not exist. So how much do we trust intuition, and when can we trust intuition?
Well, the first bit of information about intuition is that the subjective self-confidence that comes with intuition, that is not to be trusted. That is, you can be extremely confident and wrong, and in general, the correlation between confidence and accuracy is really not very high. Then we really know the conditions, I think, under which intuition can be trusted. That's been researched, and we understand them fairly well. First, the world has to be regular enough so that you have a chance to learn the regularities. So people can develop intuitions in chess, they can develop intuitions in other systems that are well organized and regular, but people who tell you that they have intuitions about Wall Street are lying to themselves. The system is just not regular enough, not predictable enough to sustain intuitions. Then people have to, if the system is regular enough, people have to have an opportunity to learn it and to acquire those regularities. And that is dependent on very rapid feedback. And it turns out that even if you live in a world that is regular and you operate in that world, if you don't get the feedback fairly quickly about the quality of your decisions, you're not going to develop intuition. To give you an example, a radiologist is much less likely to develop intuitions than an anesthesiologist, because when something goes wrong in the surgery because of anesthesia, the physician sees it immediately. The radiologist never has immediate feedback, and that creates a large difference in the quality of intuitions in the two professions.
Because following on from that, you speak about expert intuition. And so you get that expert intuition based on experience and practice. So how do we hone our expert intuition? Is that, does practice make perfect?
Well, practice makes perfect if the world is regular enough so that the practice is valuable, and if you get immediate feedback. In other situations, there is one regularity. Practice makes people more confident, even when it does not make them more accurate. So practice has its bad side as well as its good side.
So it's the conditions have to be similar.
The conditions have to be such that intuition has a chance to develop. And when those conditions are absent, then intuition is not to be trusted. And this goes really contrary to the subjective feeling that people have. When people have just experience with no feedback, they feel with increasing experience, increasingly confident. And I think what we have learned from research is that this confidence is ill-placed. You should not feel confident unless the conditions for the development of expert intuition are present.
So if you were going to hire someone and you were hiring them, I mean, primarily when we work with people, we're relying on their judgment, right? And so their experience, what they've gone through is important. So what makes you, or what would you advise, is instrumental in saying, yes, this person has the right experience that could teach them, because the conditions will rarely be similar?
Well, I mean, and there are several sides to your question. In choosing a person, in hiring a person, this is a domain where, in general, people feel very confident about their intuitions. And research really hasn't confirmed that these intuitions and the confidence is justified. People feel much more confident than they're accurate in the domain of hiring. Then when you're evaluating somebody's expertise, you know, the first thing to do is don't trust your intuition, but look at what the person has accomplished and at their performance in the past. It's really that simple. And if you should watch it, especially your enthusiastic intuitions are not necessarily to be trusted.
So we can't trust intuition too much unless it's expert intuition. But that's what people like me are relying on to say that we'll stay ahead of the machines. So can AI, can artificial intelligence develop its own intuition? Or will that make us different?
Well, in a sense, you know, this is already happening. The programs that are being developed these years, I mean, the big successes of AI in recent years have been in developing systems that play chess or play Go at a superhuman level. And especially in the recent generations of those programs, which come from DeepMind's, a company in London. In the recent generations of those programs, you watch a game of chess that this program plays against the best program, which are existing program, and those are already better than the world champion. The thing that is very impressive is that they look creative. So that machine plays beautiful, creative chess. And so this is going to happen. Given sufficient data, then of course AI will develop intuitions, and they will be better than human intuitions.
So then what will make us stand apart in our decision-making from machines?
You know, this is a much debated problem, because nobody wants to accept that machines are going to be better than people at everything. But it's becoming increasingly difficult to specify what machines are necessarily better than people at. You know, it's really not certain. Emotional intelligence, the ability to predict how people will behave, that is certainly a domain that machines are going to be better than people at doing, simply, you know, for the following obvious reason. You have a robot that is looking at facial expressions, and it learns from the facial expression to predict what comes next, the next behavior. But the point is that this robot feeds what it has learned to a central computer that learns from thousands of robots. So no individual can acquire the kind of experience that robots will very quickly acquire once you set them loose in a complicated situation.
And from your research, I mean, you're increasingly researching more artificial intelligence and its impact on our societies and so forth. Is this something that's going to happen soon? I mean, the pace of technological development.
Well, it's pretty obvious that not only is technology developing quickly, but it's developing increasingly quickly. So some people who deal with those things, I think that they're exaggerating probably, but Ray Kurzweil, who is a well-known expert, in the future, if there is such a thing, he believes that the progress of technology is exponential, so it's rapidly increasing, and it's increasing in the rate of its increase. And so he thinks that things are going to happen very quickly indeed. That is, that we're going to have computers more intelligent than people in 20, 30, 40 years. Other people are much more cautious, but the cautious people, think less than a century. So
here in the UAE, we have a minister of artificial intelligence. There's a lot of work being done on the governance of AI and who actually is training the machines, if there's going to be biases built into machines. What advice would you give for those looking at governance?
Well, clearly, the quality of the data that go into the development of the program, that is all important. And if there are mistakes built in, they're built in from the data. The programs will learn whatever the data provides, an opportunity to learn, and they will learn it correctly. And sometimes what appears to be a bias is really not a bias. That is, and that I think happens fairly frequently. That is, if there is a correlation in nature between, if there is something, say, that women do better than men, and you would be inclined to select women or to discriminate in favor of women. In general, it would go the other way, of course. But
you're optimistic.
Yeah,
I like that.
I'm being, I'm trying to be nice, but in general, if there is a real difference, then when you apply artificial intelligence, it will increase that difference. It will be even more, it will discriminate in favor of the favored group even more than people do. And it will do that simply because if it is trying to predict the real world, and in the real world there is a correlation, then the predictions of AI are going to be sharper because they're more accurate. They're going to appear to be discriminating more sharply. This is a dilemma about bias in AI, that even defining what bias is a very complex issue.
So following on from that, even knowing what those biases are, and there are, again, the unconscious biases that we're not even aware are going into some of these machines, how do we then try to mitigate against that? Well,
actually, the key thing is, what are the criterion? What do you teach the machine? What does the machine consider a success? So what you may not want is to teach the machine how you select people. So it would be quite easy to teach a machine to predict what you are going to like. And then the machine will have all your biases, and they'll be even worse than your biases. But if you train the machine to predict an external objective criterion, then the machine will discover whatever it discovers, even if we don't like it.
You've been quoted as saying that you don't believe we need to put boundaries on AI. And so I wanted to ask you about that a bit more. I mean, it could be taken out of context or misunderstood. Could you explain that a bit too? Because there are some people who say, actually, we have to put boundaries because we're worried about where this is going. And
well, I mean, there'll be boundaries if people impose boundaries. I mean, if there is regulation, it's going to be extremely difficult to set boundaries on AI because, if the Americans set boundaries, the Chinese may not, so that setting boundaries is going to be extremely difficult. Whether there are boundaries that are built in, here, I really do not see any specific human skill that given enough data, machines will be unable to learn. It's very difficult to specify. You know, we have a brain, it's a very, very good brain, and it operates beautifully, but whatever that brain does, there is going to be machinery that is going to match it and exceed it.
And then it goes back to decision-making, the title of our session, in the sense that who will ultimately have the final decision. And so, some people have raised concerns if you use, for example, AI or machines increasingly in wars. And so who makes the final decision of whether you carry out a strike or not? So again, what would you advise in terms of those sorts of decision-making, the ultimate decision maker?
Well, there is one level at which clearly you would want humans to be in charge, and they should be in charge of the principles that govern the programming of those devices. And there are going to be problems that, for which the device will not be prepared. So you would want to program it to recognize when it is not prepared and when it doesn't know the answer. When you're dealing with individual cases and there is a program generating answers and there is a human being looking at the program, and the human being is very often tempted to override what the program says. There's a lot of research on that. And the research really says that by and large, when you override a program, on average, you're going to do worse than if you didn't override. So there are rare occasions when it's absolutely clear that you should override a program, but they are rare. I'll give you an example of one, just to make it clear. If you have a program that is providing loans, that is making decisions about giving out loans. Now, if the banker notices in the morning that somebody who has been approved by a device has been arrested for fraud, then you will stop the loan, but because that's open and shut, that's very clear, and something that the program did not know. You had more recent, decisive information. In the absence of that, overriding devices is on average worse than not doing it.
And how do we train ourselves to trust our judgment? When is the time for overriding a decision? And this could be even overriding a decision for somebody who's made the decision, not necessarily just the machine. That decision making, the art of knowing when to overrule a judgment.
Well, in general, and this is going to happen. It's going to happen fairly soon. What we see is that leaders in organizations hate being second-guessed. And so many systems have been proposed for decision-making. There was, a fashion for decision analysis 20 or 30 years ago, which really has not been adopted. And the reason that it hasn't been adopted is that no leader wants a device to tell it what to do or to let it be known that this is what you should have done. Because when you make a decision, to be second-guessed by a device, especially if the decision goes wrong, this is something leaders do not want. We haven't encountered that yet, but it's coming. That is, there will be programs that will have business judgment, and how they will interact with leaders of business is going to be quite interesting. I have no idea what leaders will do to protect themselves against devices, but I'm pretty sure they'll do something.
So I guess one of the most incredible things is we're at the cusp of something where we don't have the answers, where we have to wait and see. But people do often read your work, your research, listen to you to get lessons. And so I wanted to ask you, as we get close to wrapping up the session, what do you want people who either read your works or listen to you to take away? What learnings are important for them to take away?
I think, it's going to sound trivial, but when one summarizes in one word, it's always trivial. I think discipline would be the one word today that that's the word, disciplined thinking. And And this is really contrary to intuition. This is what intuition really is. And for me, disciplined thinking means, and that's an important point I haven't made before, it means delaying intuition. Do not have early intuitions. Delay them until you have enough information. That's disciplined thinking. So it's not that I would rule out intuition, but delaying it until you have all the facts and until you have objectively thought about all the facts. That is clearly valuable. And that would be my advice if I had to give one piece of advice.
So disciplined thinking and discipline before you make a decision.
Yes.
That's wonderful. I want to thank you for this incredible conversation and for making the time. Thank you very much, Danny.
My pleasure.